since GSP's beginning, about moving resources to Southern movement organizations. And we all know the importance and why we're doing this. So let's talk about, what's holding us back in this moment. I want to start by introducing our wonderful panel and myself. If you don't know me, I'm Amber Brown. I'm GSP's program director, but I am not the star of the show today. These beautiful people are. We have Veronica Hemmingway from Coastal Community Foundation in South Carolina with us, as well as Marco from Contigo Fund, and Chantelle, who is representing the Out in the South initiative from the LGBTQ funders group. I am going to give them the floor as well as you all in this process. So as the conversation moves and flows, I would invite you to drop your name, where you're coming from, a bit about your organization in the chat, and any questions that come up for you in the process. We'll save some time at the end for all those questions to get addressed to the panel. But in the meantime, we've pulled questions that you guys have dropped in from our registrations. So we'll use those to get the conversation rolling, and we'll go from there. All right. So if we'll stop sharing the screen for a moment so we can see our beautiful folks. I'd actually like to start with Chantelle for this first question. And if you will, share a bit about you, who you are, and a little bit about why you think this conversation is important to have today.
Awesome. Hi, thanks, Amber, and thanks to the GSP team for having us. My name is Chantelle Fisher-Borne. Can y'all hear me okay? Awesome. My pronouns are she and her, and I live in Durham, North Carolina. And I work for an organization called Funders for LGBTQ Issues. I know many of you on the screen here, and I'm excited to work real closely with the GSP team. And my work is really about increasing resources for Southern LGBTQ communities who are really on the front lines of so many social justice fights in the South. And I am also a mom of 2 kids. I'm an aunt of about 13 kids. And I've been spending some time with my family this summer in a way that I hadn't been able to since the pandemic. And so just enjoying some family time, and hence my bronze tan right now. And so I'm just appreciating that, and actually getting over a little bit of a COVID situation over here. So just sending lots of blessings and love to everybody. And I'm excited to be in this conversation and just happy to be talking with all of you. So is that good, Amber? Anything else you want me to share to kick us off?
Oh, just a little bit about why you think it's important that we have this conversation today.
I mean, for me, our work is really about how do we help funders move money in a way that resources the kind of critical work we need right now. And I think we all have a role to play in releasing money in a way that is easier to access to organizations that we know are doing so much good work, particularly people of color-led organizations and queer and trans organizations. And for me, it's just, we're in a time of a lot of, terrible crises that some are new, some aren't. And I think we're in a time of really, I think, creative ideas for both movement organizations and people moving money well. And I think for me, it's like, how do we just take our seats over the next 5 and 10 years and work in partnership with movement organizations to be able to do what we can, because we all have a lot that we can be doing. So yeah, that's why I think it's important.
Thank you. Marco, can you do the same for us?
Hey, everyone. So happy to be here with you all today. I feel really honored to be able to share space with you all to talk about this important issue. My name is Marco Antonio Quiroga. I use he, him, el pronouns. I'm based here in Orlando, Florida, with the Contigo Fund. And I like to often start off by saying that, I never imagined myself as a person who would be in philanthropy. I am undocumented, unafraid, queer, and unashamed. I grew up here in Orlando. I come from a family of immigrants who had a single mother, experienced homelessness as a family, experienced homelessness myself as a queer youth here in Orlando, and philanthropy. And the reason why I'm in philanthropy is not because philanthropy has shifted in terms of its thinking or opened its doors in terms of access, but it took a massacre. It took a massacre here in Orlando, the Pulse nightclub shooting that took the lives of 49 individuals and permanently scarred 300 other individuals who are physically present at the nightclub, as well as thousands of more individuals who are connected to those individuals. And it took a massacre for not only me to be in the sector, but for Contigo as the first and only LGBTQ Latinx fund and largest funder for LGBTQ communities of color to even exist. And I think the importance of the conversation today is thinking about the 6-year journey that we've been on. So we just did the 6-year remembrance of the Pulse shooting this past June. So it was the 6-year mark. 2 years into the tragedy, we saw an increase in funding and support for Orlando's LGBTQ communities, for the survivors and the victims. And 2 years after the shooting, we saw a severe decrease. We actually did a report here, funding reports, tracking report in partnership with Funders for LGBTQ Issues that showed that about half of the resources that we were receiving in response to the recovery after the Pulse shooting were halved 2 years after the shooting. And that's a reality that our communities are living through, and particularly here in the South, that are experiencing these incidences of mass violence and climate disasters, like in places like in Uvalde in Texas, and in other places across the country too, that like Buffalo and Laguna Woods, where oppressed queer and trans people of color, marginalized folks are being exposed to tremendous amounts of violence. And in particular, on an issue that I think that we obviously should be discussing today as well, around gun access and gun violence, which folks should be really centering in terms of their thinking in the current climate, political and social climate that we're in. If you're not thinking about gun violence as an LGBTQ issue, if you're not thinking about gun violence as a Southern issue, if you're not thinking about gun violence as a racial justice issue, if you're not thinking about gun violence as a public health issue, the #1 leading cause of death amongst our children in the United States because they're being gunned down. So if you're not thinking about this issue and thinking about how you're responding through your role, through the power that you hold in philanthropy, then you're missing the mark. And if you're not coming into community and forming strong partnership and relationship with people, and particularly in communities that have experienced instances of massive violence and tragedy and trauma, then you're missing the point. And so I'm hoping that we're, as a collective today, we'll be able to center our thinking around these issues. And I'm doing this work in Florida. So if you're thinking about the attacks against women, in terms of the reproductive justice issues, thinking about attacks against immigrants, where unaccompanied minors are being pushed out of shelters and police are being deputized to act as ICE agents. If you're thinking about people of color, where literally our racial history is being erased, and now schools are teaching slavery, changing the word slavery to forced migration, and teaching slavery as forced resettlement now here in Florida. That's how they're teaching our history. If you're thinking of queer and trans folks and how they can't even identify or be safe and affirmed in our schools because of Don't Say LGBTQ law here in Florida, or any of the myriad of issues, Florida is being used as a laboratory for the things that are going to be spread across our country. And so thinking about like the South as the place where we need to invest, because literally all of our collective liberation depends on us making investments in the South. So thanks, y'all.
Marco, thank you. Veronica, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work as a funder and why you think this conversation is important?
Sure. I don't know if I want to follow Marco anymore, though. Next time I want to jump up out of my chair in full agreement there. I'm Veronica Hemmingway, and I work here at Coastal Community Foundation, and I am calling in today from Charleston, South Carolina. My work here at the foundation centers on our 4 most southern rural counties in our footprint. So the bulk of my work is around rural communities. And, I'm listening to Chantelle, I'm listening to Marco, and I hear intersections for myself as to why I think this conversation is important and why I do the work that I do. And it has a lot to do with about who's proximate to the power. That is the reason that I was in philanthropy. I, like Marco, never saw myself in philanthropy, couldn't have told you what it was, what it meant. But working in so many nonprofits and seeing how things were administered and done and how I thought they were tone deaf and all of these things, I thought, well, let me jump in the middle, let me get in there and fix it from the inside. So I think a lot of my approach to how I do my work and why I think this conversation is important is because there need to be voices in spaces with funders who are going to tell the truth about what's happening in community. Doesn't have to always happen to me. I just have to speak the truth. I see my role as such. I don't think community needs to learn how to speak philanthropy speak. That's my responsibility, is to translate what they are experiencing and living into the language that philanthropy needs to hear without changing the efficacy or the fidelity of what they've shared. So basically no sugarcoating. So that's why I do this work in general, and why I think this conversation is so important is because what I see in my work, there's a huge gap between have and have nots. And there is a way that people who are disenfranchised are not allowed to speak their truth. They are told what's best for them, how they should move, how they should fix their own communities. And I think that this conversation is important because we need to allow them to do for their communities as they see fit. And then we should just support them in that. So I think that's why this conversation is so important.
Thank you. Thank you. You actually touched on a lot of what I would like to bring into our next question. And it's really around the ways that we have seen traditional philanthropic practices cause harm to communities, and especially Southern movement organizations or rural organizations who are out there already doing the work. Like, philanthropy is not impeding their ability to affect change in their communities. So I'd like to hear from you, not necessarily about those negative experiences and how we're continuing to do the wrong thing, but really, what are some of the promising practices and experiments that you all have been involved in that work to kind of interrupt that dynamic and to really move resources in a way that really align with what organizations need and want? Veronica, if you'd like to start, I'll pass it to Chantelle afterwards.
Sure. I think for me, there are a couple of different pieces of work that I have that I think do that. But one of them is there is a capacity building cohort, honestly, that's in its pilot phase that I'm working on this year, that is really centered around grassroots, small nonprofits in rural counties. And as we're going through this process, it's really about co-defining what this work looks like for them. What capacity do you need, and how can we deliver to you what you need to do your work better? So it's not to pick and choose what they do, but just how can we deliver you these supports? And for me, it was very interesting to see that the organizations that we are working with in our pilot phase were already people we were funding on some level, but they needed more support to be able to sustain themselves. So we were already seeing the impact of their great work in the community, but like, how can we give them what they need to sustain themselves? And so a lot of this capacity building cohort is on what you might call the obvious topics for a nonprofit. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's fundraising, maybe it's all of those things, but it's delivering them the content that they told me that they needed, not what I thought they needed to know. What do you need to know? And more specific to that, I have taken very painstaking measures to find people to deliver that message to them that do the work that they do. That's sometimes harder than I would like it to be, but I'm very intentional around finding people that they can receive it from, building a peer-to-peer conversation among them, and staying out of it, quite frankly. Like, I don't show up to the session, because I know even if it's a funder and we have a great relationship, I can throw off the dynamic if I am there. So I don't go there. I don't go in any space that I don't need to be in when they are trying to learn and grow, and we are delivering to them the services that they need. So, you know, that's just one of the things, but it's a really intentional philosophy for me to be able to provide simply community what they need and just get out of the way. You know, I think Amber has heard me say before that, you know, I feel like as funders, our job, you know, if and when we show up in spaces and community, is to show up in humility and silence, because that's just the way that you learn. And then take what you learn and do with it what you're supposed to, with not my lens, not a foundation lens, but the lens of the people that we're here to serve.
Chantelle, would you like to add anything?
I really appreciate what Veronica said. I think, and just to name, you know, what Veronica's talking about, and I feel like how I approach this conversation is really countercultural to traditional philanthropy. You know, I think traditional philanthropy you could think of it as like white supremacy culture on steroids. You know, as far as like people in this sort of system of philanthropy wanting to maintain the status quo, sort of a charity mindset, a benevolent, you know, funder type. I know better than the folks, you know, kind of who I'm given the money, sort of this very paternalistic approach as a funder. And I think that for me, what does it mean to have a more honest relationship with organizations and community where folk can be real of what they need? For us, that's come out of two pieces that we're working on, is how to work with, you know, national and southern funders who want to invest in the South and all kinds of foundations. And there's an issue around like some funders say they can't do it, but they can, they just won't. And some funders say they can't do it, but they just don't know how. And so that second part is who we work with. You know, we can work with the folks who want to do it and want to figure out how. So there's a lot more flexibility that funders can have around reporting requirements and access and the sort of the ways that they make sense of who they can give money to and who they can't. Because when you look at it, you know, the way that so many local grassroots organizations and so what we think as ecosystems of organizations and groups in Southern communities run the gamut, you know, policy work, grassroots organizing, direct services, faith-based communities, all the ways of like folks doing great stuff, you know, whatever, and all kinds of formations. And how do you have an honest take of what that's like? And then how do you be real of where you have pipes to resource that work? Where philanthropy can screw things up is only having pipes in a certain place, you know what I'm saying? And then being like, only this row of plants gets watered, so to speak, and then that becomes the movement. When really we all know it's quite more complicated. And so there's another piece of it around capacity building that I would say, which has been a promising conversation that's been happening for decades in GSP space, in Contigo space, and all the ways, I think, how do movement organizations protect themselves from funders screwing up their work, you know, and what is the work of being in a unique partnership with movement organizations to help them make sense of like how to navigate this stuff. And so for us, that's been part of how we've worked with groups like some of the Out in the South funds, which we fund Southern-based funds like Contigo and others that have been in honest conversation, like the kind of capacity building and leadership development that Marco does, you know, with the Contigo Fund. You know, that's not like someone's piping something in from Oakland, California, you know what I'm saying? It's like it's much more real and contextual. And, you know, to be honest, it's sobering, you know, conditions are difficult, you know, folks are doing so much with so little and brilliant. And so how do you not sort of distort that and have the funding really resource folks where they are and that people can be honest? Because then the other thing is like, if there's this sort of power differential that isn't named or somehow modified, you know, funders, people just lie to each other, you know what I'm saying? As far like for grantee, like we got it all together, it's fine. And that disrupts both their relationship with their peer organizations that can just really, you know, create a difficult dynamic within community. And so how do you help, you know, organizations on the front lines have a better consciousness around money? And this gets into some technical things around, we'll talk about this later, like fiscal sponsorship and, you know, how do you support leaders, queer and trans marginalized communities who, you know, haven't been in these leadership positions and are feeling the pressure to behave a certain way from funders, you know what I'm saying? But I feel that's where I feel like I'm excited. Across the board, I find there are examples of people, of funders sitting in lots of different varieties of foundations and funder spaces that are doing a lot of great work to move the levers, to be more creative and to be like, you know, this is where money's getting stuck. I can't do it in my shop, but can I move it to a different bucket? where someone else can be more creative than I can be. You know, so I think that's what I find really promising, where people are just like willing to be honest about where their institutions aren't able to serve movement in the way they want to, and they find ways around it. So that's where, you know, intermediaries like Contigo come in, or, you know, Veronica shop with the community foundation. There are ways around the limitations of your institution in this regard. So that's what I find really hopeful for me.
Wonderful. And you've used Contigo as an example a couple of times just in that conversation, and I agree with you entirely that they're really taking a different approach from it, and it's coming from that lived experience, it's coming from that community space. So Marco, I would love to invite your thoughts into this question around what are you doing? How are you implementing these practices and these experiments that's really aligning your funding with what movement actually needs?
Yeah, and so I guess I would like to start off with how we got where we got, because a lot of folks, they often think that it's it is a tremendous task to be authentically community-driven type of model and in philanthropy. Because it's an antithesis of what philanthropy wasn't made for, right? It wasn't made for people like me to be running or leading in it, right? It wasn't made for many of us to exist in. And it definitely wasn't made to empower our people. It was made to look at our people through a charity and needs lens versus a justice lens, right? And so Contigo kind of decolonized all of the traditional kind of practices and within philanthropy, and started with by listening to community, like Veronica was mentioning, listening to what people told us what they needed. In response to when the Pulse shooting happened, we launched a community needs assessment in partnership with Funders for LGBTQ issues. Chantelle was a part of that process, so knows it really well. And we, in that process itself, we were able to identify leaders because Orlando and Central Florida was historically under-resourced. Prior to the tragedy, all LGBTQ or nonprofits, organizations, grassroots, advocacy groups were functioning with less than $200,000 spread across the entire ecosystem. Less than $200,000 for all LGBTQ issues across all of Central Florida in foundation giving. And so they were historically under-resourced, and folks often talk to us about not seeing themselves in places of power because they never saw someone who looked like them, spoke like them, or had their lived experience. Not being able to access services because whatever door they would knock on, if there's a trans woman looking for housing, trans affirming care, or just like a support group, they couldn't get like directed to the right places in a culturally competent and compassionate way. So that was the reality of where we were living. So when we did the needs assessment, we connected with folks who weren't connected to nonprofits. They were folks out in the community that were serving their community in a grassroots way, but were closest to the issues. Much closer to the issues and the realities of those people, because the people that we're seeking to serve most often aren't the people who are currently linked to nonprofits, who are working for nonprofits. They're the people who fall through the safety nets that those profits have propped it up. Why? Because those nonprofits are under-resourced, and the hardest to reach people are the people that we're hoping to reach the most, right? And so those are the people who should be guiding us, because we believe that the people who are closest to the challenges are also closest to the solutions we need. And so when Contigo first was launched, we created a participatory model community board that was fully representative of the full spectrum of queer and trans communities, and particularly communities of color, which is what the particular group that was most affected by the Pulse tragedy were LGBTQ people of color. And so, and most of those folks weren't in nonprofit work. As a result of that work, all of those individuals is a 14-member board And we have multiple steering committees. We have an All Black Lives steering committee and fund that supports particularly queer and trans Black leaders that launched after the 2020 uprisings, racial justice uprisings. And so we have over 20 individuals in our community board and in our steering committees. And all of them are from community. Most of them joined us from just like their lived experience and being connected to in the roots of the community. And today, every single one of them serve on nonprofit boards, multiple nonprofit boards, serve on government advisories, and serve on other foundation boards. And that's how the decolonization of this ecosystem, the nonprofit industrial complex ecosystem that is propped up to, in many ways, keep movement from doing what movement does best, and perpetrated by traditional philanthropy that was propped up to keep movements from doing what movements do best, because that deconstructing colonialist thinking, our colonizers weren't thinking of using philanthropy for that purpose. They're using it to have tax write-offs and to keep us in our place, to create a system that made a 501c nonprofit legal process for us to control our movements. And so Contigo, in all those ways, in terms of thinking about decolonizing philanthropy, thought about creating new systems. So it's trust-based. And I use trust-based as a word as this new like big term that philanthropy likes to use. But trust-based essentially is a question of like who's deserving. Who is deserving of trust and who is deserving of managing resources, of having power, right? And philanthropy often doesn't see our people, like myself, an undocumented young queer trans person of color who grew up with the conditions that I grew up here in Orlando, as a person who's deserving of managing money and power and leadership in this movement, in this sector, right? And so it is a question of who's deserving, and shifting that thinking of who is deserving, because the most deserving people to be able to do this work are the people who are most impacted by these issues. And then you, Amber, you talked about, the very last thing I'm just going to say is that you talked about the harm that traditional philanthropy has caused. And I just want to say that in this particular political and social moment that we're living through, where we're seeing attacks against women, against immigrants, people of color, queer and trans folks, that those attacks sit on the doorstep of traditional philanthropy. Because of traditional philanthropy's historic de-investment in places across the South, like Florida, because of how they define wins, legislative wins, because what we know to be true is in places like Texas, Florida, Georgia, the truth is that we're robustly brown and Black, we're robustly young, we're robustly queer and trans, and we lean progressive. But because of gerrymandering and disenfranchisement and criminalization, our people are invisibilized. And so the right blurs this truth, and then creates this red versus blue and purple state kind of dynamic to make the truth invisibilized to us. And our job, I think, in this and on the roles that we play, is to illuminate truth to the fact that our people are here, that progressive power can happen here in Florida, it can happen in Texas, it can happen in Georgia. It needs massive investment, and traditional philanthropy needs to reevaluate what wins look like, what local wins look like, what progressive coalition building looks like, what true progress can look like here in the South and for the rest of our country. Because what happens in the South happens across our country.
Yep, I think we all know that to be completely true. We are the guiding post for what blooms into the rest of the states. Marco, you actually mentioned something that I kind of want to dig a little bit more deeply into, and it's all about building relationships. I know funders often, well, at least I've heard from folks, they say things like, I can't really find folks to fund in these spaces that I'm funding. How do you identify the folks that you want to be in relationship with. And then on the second piece of it, how do you build trust and sustainable relationships with folks who are on the ground doing the work and really don't have time to sit down and talk to 17 funders all day long about, this is why I do the work and this is why it's important. So if you all will share, and Marco, I can start with you if you like, a little bit about how you identify the groups that you work with, and really how do you build those relationships with folks to make sure that it's not an extractive relationship, but one that is giving.
Yeah, so really quickly, like I mentioned, the community needs assessment, and that was a really huge piece for us, for Contigo, to locate the individuals who weren't the token folks, at nonprofits, the one Black person or one Latinx person at this one nonprofit that everyone goes to, right? Because they're the only person in leadership that folks know in the community. But to see leadership in a different way, right? It doesn't require a person to be in the nonprofit sector. It requires them to be in community, and being able to reach those people. When you're saying they're hard to find, it's because you haven't gone into that community and had these actual conversation, authentic conversation with those folks in those communities. Because I can tell you, in our process, we have constant town halls, and we're constantly have listening sessions and things like that, because we need that connection to be connected to the true leaders on the ground who are doing the incredible work. A really good example of that is this Black trans woman, Mulan Williams, who was for decades doing work for the trans community as essentially the mother of the trans community here in Orlando. She was opened up her home to trans folks who moved here and were experiencing homelessness, to sex workers going out to the street to help them, to support them in terms of giving them condoms, to know your rights, like bailing them out of jail, to doing all of this work and completely unpaid and unrecognized, right? And then today, now she runs her own trans organization, Divas in Dialogue, which is one of the largest organizations for trans communities here in all of Central Florida. It has grown into a beautiful space for movement work, led by and for trans communities, particularly trans women of color. And it's once you not only give the opportunity that they deserve to them, but also resource them and see them for the leaders that they are, that is how you're going to see real progress in your community happen. And the last thing I'll say is that prior to the Pulse shooting, here in Orlando, there were 0 organizations that are led by and for LGBTQ people of color, the most impacted by the shooting. Today, there's 11 organizations that are led by trans communities, API communities, Black communities, Latinx communities, grassroots organizations focused on mental health, HIV advocacy, immigrant rights, and all of them are doing incredible work to transform our region. But none of them existed prior to the tragedy. And often I would say that you have to connect with the people, see where the movement is happening within community in an unstructured, in an informal way, and be their first grant maker. Give them their first grant. Often philanthropy thinks of themselves as risk averse, like as if giving a grant to people who are already doing the work is a risk. No, it's the best opportunity you have. And it's because they are deserving of it. And shifting that, again, going back to like who is and isn't deserving, right? They are the most deserving of that. And so give them their first grant so they can kick off their organization and really have the resources to take it to the next level.
Thank you. That is beautiful. I think what I heard Marco say that I really want to highlight for everyone is that the people are there. It's not that they don't exist. They're there. If you come into community, if you engage authentically, you will find them. Veronica, I know this is a little different for the community foundation space. And I think as Coastal Community Foundation has several counties in their footprint, like you mentioned, and you cover 4 of them, tell me a little bit about your process and how it works for you to find folks to support and build relationship with.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think for me, it's probably I was listening to Marco and thinking, he and I have a lot in common about how we approach this. But for me, I think I can't separate how I do my work from who I am. And that is a Black person from South Carolina who has seen all the disparities, all of the things. And so the way I move in community is the way I move all the time. So I want to know what's going on. I just go talk to people. And I intentionally try to minimize the fact that I'm showing up in my funder hat. Right. And I just sit and I listen. I really do. I just talk to folk, and you'll be surprised how many things you can hear just listening to people. Not, oh, I read this data point, or oh, who asked you? Like, just sit and listen, and you'll hear the issues. You'll hear who to talk to, who the trustworthy people are in the community, who are the leaders. And I come from a family for multiple generations who would never be considered traditional leaders. Right. But I also know who showed up at our house all the time and were around the dinner table and the conversations and the things, the organizing that went on around the table too. So I think for me, I can see all those things in community. I know where to go and talk and listen, and not going in because, well, we want something from you. No, I want something from you. Right. You don't owe me anything. I need to know what you know so I can help you do what you do. So I think that just happens to be my own personal lens of how I move. So that's why I'm able to find places and organizations, because I come from a background where those organizations never got funded by any funders. They never got funded by anybody. So I know kind of who they are and where they are. And I think that's really how I found some people. There is one particular organization I'm thinking of that's in this, cohort that I mentioned earlier. We never funded him before at all. Never even heard of him at all. I met him at an event. I talked to him for about 10 minutes and I was like, this guy has to be in here. Like, I don't know what he's done. I don't know what his 990 looks like. I don't know any of that, but I know who I'm having this conversation with. And I know how he's showing up back in his community. Like, I just had a feeling, honestly. And so we put him in a cohort. And during COVID, he got 2 grants from us to work in the education space with kids in a rural county that nobody else could reach. And he also, we managed to open a few doors. He went on to be named by the Chamber of Commerce in his county as the Educational Partner of the Year. Go figure. Nobody heard of him. Other funders, quite frankly, had dismissed him, had told me, like, nah, he's not. And I was like, yeah, well, if you're telling me, oh no, that's probably where I'm going to go focus on. Like, so you told me that he wasn't doing anything legit. I'm like, oh, well, he must be doing something legit. So that's just kind of how that worked out. And when I think about working with him, I'm watching that organization grow and him blossom and learn all these great things that we were able to provide for him. But the thing that I will always remember is that when he came to me and said, thank you for seeing me. Nobody else saw me before. This organization has been around for a few years. Nobody saw me. And it just goes back to the other point. It matters, all the things that Marco mentioned matter, but it also matters who's doing the looking. And that's where the diversity and the inclusion in this sector in general makes a difference, because it matters who's doing the looking.
That's beautiful. Chantelle, I want to pass this question over to you, but I also want to add another element to it, because Veronica brought up something that I think is extremely important, and it's something that we tend to shy away from in philanthropy, and that's supporting individual leaders, folks who are on the ground moving this work. When you have a small shop and you've got people who are, trying to do everything on their own and bringing in their community and volunteers as they can. So I wanted to open that question up to you about identifying folks, but also kind of invite the question of how funders might support various types of groups and structures and organizations or individuals who are on the front lines who are working across the South.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think I'm listening to Marco and Veronica talking, I'm like, yeah, this sort of like this posture of like a leadership posture that is horizontal, that isn't egotistical, that the way that the two of you show up in community, I think that's just something that we often, I think white supremacy culture doesn't think of it as leadership, what I'm saying? And I think there's a way to just really honor the ways in which so many Southern movement folk and so many Southern movement organizations have this way of doing what they've been doing forever, regardless of whether funders see them or not. And how do we appreciate that? And I think for me, I'm reminded of being trained. One of my mentors around, I've come into public health, like community-based public health work. And one of my mentors, she did a whole process around how to find folks who people trust in a community. And her process wasn't about people going through a process where people nominate themselves, but she did this beautiful process of talking to people. Who do you go to when you need something? Over took time and all that, but she was interested in developing leaders who were humble, who were just doing their thing. And I think that to me is the essence of, I think, how so many community-based organizations in Southern community who are supporting communities that are outside of what dominant culture values. We can talk about that, communities of color, immigrant communities, trans communities. And I think, how can funders not disrupt and commodify it in a screwed up way, but actually support it in the way that it is? And I just want to say, like, the way Marco and Veronica speak about their work is I feel really appreciative of them and other folk who want to do this in philanthropy too. And there are folks who are sitting in all kinds of institutions that are moving in a very sophisticated and graceful way, but is often just so undervalued, and I just want to say that it's a really skillful and thoughtful approach. And I think it really resonates in community. And I think for me, this comes into when those of us sitting in these seats approach work in this way, and then can understand the machinery or the mechanics of how to move money well. And I think this is where, the technical parts of, like, can I move it to an individual? Can I move it to a certain type of organization? I think that there are ways around there are ways to stay inside the tax code and keep your organization safe, so to speak. But you can also be really flexible, because so many of the things that funders think they can't do are based on whether or not they think an organization is janky or not. I mean, it's like whether they don't appreciate how a group might be able to write a really great grant proposal and they have a PhD in grant writing, but so we've done actual audits with grant makers to look at their process to help them understand which kinds of organizations are totally left out of even just the access. And so when we're like, hey, you have to have a graduate level of reading level to actually respond to these questions, not to even talk about the type of organization you're expecting to have 2 years of audits and so really kind of getting under the hood with some funders on the technicalities and helping them lower the barriers and to do the authentic, I would say, trust-based grant making that allows a lot of these strings that are really based on dominant cultural narratives about what organizations are worthy of resources. And so that to me is where the piece around money to individuals, I think folks can be a lot more flexible. And I think where I see it moving with a lot of creativity, one of the experiments I'm part of is a Southern Power Fund. And this whole process of like these organizations, for anchors and more, using their standing with funders as Southern movement kind of legacy organizations and being like, we're kind of tired of this game and we're going to redistribute money to groups we know are doing beautiful work or but are way off your radar. So that process has been with the ethic and in the spirit of we aren't going, and we also know the problem of being a funder darling. So we're going to take what we're getting and use that to the benefit of a community that we know isn't on, in this orbit, so to speak. And so there's a lot of different ways, I think, to approach and the money individual piece. I think it's really about structures in place that you can trust, the group, whoever's deciding on the process, appreciates the work that a person's doing in community. And there are lots of different ways to get around C3 status. I know like Alternate Roots does grants to artists, who do great work. That I think there is a myth out there that it's only $600 you can give an individual when it's really not true. So there are lots of different set of creative ways around it. But yeah, so I just appreciate what everybody's saying. Is that, Amber, anything else you want to say about that?
That's perfectly on topic. I wanted to open the floor as we're nearing the end of our time to any last thoughts that Marco, Veronica, and Chantelle you may have, just in how folks can move forward in this process. What are the first steps to really kind of addressing, how you're moving resources and where you're missing? Marco, you want to start?
Sure. I think this moment calls us on all to be really revolutionary in our thinking, because we're living through essentially apocalyptic times. Our democracy is under attack. All of our people are under attack. Like our way of life, like people's ability to maintain their homes, food security, healthcare, any like material conditions of every single person that we know is under attack and is in a really challenging place, right? So it requires us to be a really the people on the inside, the people who are agitating, and the people who are moving others who have become complacent. Because what we know to be true in philanthropy is that it's an old boys club, and it also includes people who refuse to leave and create space for others who are authentically connected to community. And I also think the people who are the longest in philanthropy are often the most detached from the realities that the world and people that are living through. And so I call on everyone to be agitators. I call on everyone to really be the ones who push and say, we need to look at these groups, these individuals, these leaders. We need to think of leadership in a different way. We need to think of who we're funding in a different way, and we need to move money in a different way. And there's examples of how we can do it across the country. From Contigo to community funds, the folks that are here today, like we can connect you, we can provide you with resources, we can support you in that journey as well. And I think this is the moment now more than ever that we're called to be really, really intentional and active around all of these issues, because we're in a moment of crisis and we need everyone to be responders in this crisis.
Thank you, Marco. Veronica, would you like to take up the helm next and we wrap up with Chantelle?
Sure. And before I do that, I do want to mention for other, foundations that may be on the call, one of the programs that we have here at our foundation that does work a little differently, that makes space for groups, is that we have a fund here that's been around since 1991, and it's called the New Fund, and it is specifically for small grassroots organizations and neighborhood associations, right? So that you don't actually have to have a 501c3 to actually get the grant. So essentially, when they are granted funds through this program, they're using the 501c3 of the foundation. Now, that probably have a lot to do with the fact that these grants are smaller. They max out at like $3,000. However, over the course of since 1991, there are a lot of neighborhoods and community things that have done a lot of powerful work in their community with $3,000. And what they will tell you, and what the core of the program is that we don't tell them what to do. It's literally what we're talking about today. They come to us and was like, what does your community want to do? What does your community need? Is the community garden? Do y'all want to do voter registration? Like whatever. And so it's not prescriptive what they do. It's part of them is actually showing that the community wants to do whatever project they're applying for. So, and I know, because we all know we have to have audits and things or whatever, and that puts the foundation at some level of risk, but it works. It works for a lot of people to have done a lot of things and been the kind of backbone of a lot of change that's gone on in communities in Charleston since 1991. So just saying that if you are a traditional foundation, there are ways to do things differently that make space for other people and other ideas and other ways of approaching the work. So I did want to kind of put that out there that, there are ways to do lots of things. But I think kind of in conclusion, I would say something else that's really important to me, I think probably more than anything, is the access part of it for me. And that's what I would challenge people to really spend their time and their energy around, is who knows about you and how can they access you, and putting yourself out there to find them and not waiting for them to find you and figure out how you work, but make sure that you're doing it the other way. And And when it gets right down to it, the part about Chantelle saying having a PhD to fill out an application, it's not supposed to be that hard, y'all. Like, it's really not. I know here in our department, every single year before we post applications, we review every single question on every application for that reason. Is this language approachable? Can I understand? Like, if I were on their side, would I even know what this meant? And for me, having worked at nonprofits, quite frankly, I just undo some stuff that I didn't like when I worked for nonprofits and I wrote grants. I'm like, I'm never going to ask that question again that way, because I didn't know what they were talking about when I had to answer it. So it's really just recognizing that, making it approachable, making the language something that anyone can understand, and knowing that not every piece of data that you want is necessary. It might be a nice to have, but it's not necessary. So one of my kind of pet peeves is asking random questions on applications just because you're curious about a data point. It just makes a lot of work for a lot of people to figure out, and it's not really even necessary. So that is just my own personal point of privilege. I wanted to say that because that always really sticks at me, and like, don't do that to people. And I think lastly, again, I think from my perspective, it's just step outside yourself. Remember, this work isn't about you as a person, or it is about serving community. That is what we are here to do. The money is meant to go out the door. And so let's figure out how we can make that happen in the most responsible, respectful, and inclusive way, truly inclusive, not the buzzword version, but truly inclusive way. That's it.
And telling the last thoughts before we let the good people go.
I know this is great. I ditto what Marco and Veronica said, and I just want to offer an invitation. If you're not already, join over on the GSP train. I think just join us in problem solving together. I think that's the fun part of some of the funder collaborative work without the South or GS. Just know that you can problem solve with people, and there are ways to be creative. And like, we're here to think through. I know I've learned so much from Marco. I'm just getting to know Veronica. I'm excited. Just know that we can be more creative, I feel like, together. And I think don't be shy to reach out and be like, hey, I'm stuck on this thing, and let's talk it through with people.
Thank you. Well, that's it, folks. I would like to say thank you to you all for coming, but really give a round of applause for the three brilliant minds we have in front of us. They have all offered up resources to one another, just as the GSP team is. We are here to really help push investments into the South in ways that really serve the South. So if you got a question, call us. If you want to join us and be a part of the movement, call Simone. She is here. She will help you get set up as a part of our network. But otherwise, I want to wish that you have a wonderful rest of your week and enjoy some of the summer and stay out of the heat. It will be great to see you at our next funder conversation. It is August 11th. I believe it's at 2:00. Don't hold me to it. Where we are going to revisit white Christian nationalism and the ways that funders and foundations and philanthropy as a whole plays a role in really kind of breaking that down. So I would love to say again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.